Hola mi gente, bienvenidos a mi canal. Hoy vamos a hablar sobre una cultura y idioma fascinante, el mixteco. Vamos a aprender sobre de dónde vino, cómo se ha evolucionado y su estado actual hoy en día. Vámonos mi gente. So, Mixteco is considered a member of the language family of Oto-Manguean and has a super rich history that is stretched back thousands of years in Mexico. The Mixtec people originally lived and still live to this day in the southern part of Mexico, specifically in Oaxaca, which even nowadays is one of the most linguistically rich areas of Mexico. You find Mixteco, you find Zapoteco, you find Chatino, you find a ton and ton of Tzotzil and Tzetzal in Chiapas. In the south, you find a ton of indigenous languages. So the Mixtec civilization was actually here before Columbus came and discovered the Americas. And they were known for complex hieroglyphics, impressive artwork, and a very advanced understanding of agriculture. Now, Mixteco isn't just a single language. It's actually a cluster of different dialects which form in the different mountains, valleys of Oaxaca. Because the Mixtec region is so mountainous and isolated when it comes to these valleys, it means that different Mixtec communities developed over time in each one of these valleys, and with it they developed their own dialect of the Mixteco language. And because they all developed semi-separately from each other, each one has their own unique vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. In fact, some of them are so different, even though they're considered the same language, that going from one valley to the other, they can't understand each other. Some people say that these dialectal differences go back to their organization as city-states, where each little city-state had its own power and was its own thing, and so developed its own sense of identity and culture, and with that, language. So what this means is that Mixteco is not actually just one single language, but rather a family of dialects that developed around the same time in the same geographic region for each of the communities which it served. So next up, we're going to talk about how Mixteco spread. So as the Mixtec civilization grew, this language became super important in what is now the southern part of Mexico, the state of Oaxaca. The Mixtec people formed like city-states spread out across all the valleys and the mountains, right, in the Oaxaca Valley and beyond. This people was super highly organized, and so over time, their culture, their political influence, and their language spread around Mexico and became a dominant language in that southern Mexico region. So Mixteco was specifically used a lot for things like trade, diplomacy, and administration in areas where there were Mixtec people. And because they were such huge traders, they got to interact with other cultures of the time, like the Zapotecs, like the Mexica, like the Mayans, which helped to spread their language. And as trade routes expanded, Mixteco in this area became a lingua franca for the various people groups to be able to trade and congregate and just share space. Right? There were some political and economic factors that also solidified Mixteco's place as a dominant language in the region. And that is the fact that the Mixteco Empire oftentimes had lots of land and huge control of resources. Also, the fact that they had a written script helped them to be able to record their language and so be able to transmit it through religious practices, art, rituals, record keeping, things like that. So for Mixteco, their dominance came from a variety of factors. One, the population size. They were the dominant people in the region. They had lots of geopolitical power. They had a ton of cultural influence through art, religion, and trade and diplomacy. And they also had huge trade networks throughout southern Mexico that elevated Mixteco to be like a lingua franca for the region. So of course, we can't talk about any of the indigenous cultures in Mexico without talking about what happened with the arrival of the Spanish and colonization in this area. And for the Mixteco people, just like for many of the other indigenous groups in Mexico that lived and still live in this area, the arrival of the Spanish changed their lives forever. Namely, one of the biggest ways that the Spanish exerted control over the indigenous populations was suppression of their language. They kicked the language out of education. They implemented Spanish or maybe Latin in religious services, specifically in Spanish in schools and things like that, so that they were forced to learn the language of the colonizers and forget their own. And this imposition of their language and their religion and their way of life forced many of the Mixteco people to have to give up their traditional way of life and were forcibly assimilated into the population. However, one advantage that Mixteco had was the area in which it was found. It was found in these mountainous valleys in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, up in the hills, right? And because of this, it made them quite difficult to conquer, right? And because of this isolation, because of this remoteness, they were able to hold on to their traditions and their language a lot more than some other places, right? And in fact, this language of Mixteco is still widely spoken today in Oaxaca. It's one of the most popular indigenous languages in Mexico after, I believe, Nahuatl, Mayan, specifically of the Yucatan, and I believe Zapoteco actually might beat them out as well. I'm not sure on that. They're 3 or 4, I think. So nowadays, Mixteco is still spoken by 500,000 people, right? Mostly the state of Oaxaca, but also in parts of Guerrero, Puebla, Veracruz. And in fact, Oaxaca is one of the states in Mexico with the highest linguistic diversity. And Mixteco is a huge part of that said diversity. The language has survived despite attempts by the Spanish to kick it out, and is still used in many rural communities today in Oaxaca. However, just like with many indigenous languages, they face all kinds of problems, namely a declining interest and a declining number of speakers as the older people who were born with this language die off. They leave younger people who either only semi-acquired it or didn't acquire it at all to then try and continue to preserve the language. Especially given that many younger Mexicans are switching towards Spanish in all cases because it provides more social mobility, economic mobility. You can go to a city and get a job, right? They are tending to leave behind this Mixteco language, right? However, there are efforts to keep the language alive. There are bilingual education programs. There are language courses in the Mixteco language, cultural projects designed to lift up the language. And you can even study it, I believe, in universities in parts of Mexico. So what is the current situation of Mixteco? Well, Mixteco is identified as an official language in Mexico, along with other indigenous languages like Mayan, like Nahuatl, like Zapoteco. The Mexican government, along with local organizations, has made a real effort to preserve this language and give it the boost it needs. They have radio programs, language workshops, community initiatives to help promote the learning of and speaking of Mixteco in everyday life. For example, some local radio stations broadcast in Mixteco, offering both music and talk shows in the language, which help keep the language present in the media. And then on top of that, you have cultural festivals and traditional rituals that continue to preserve the Mixtecan culture in the language. Nowadays, there's also a ton of bilingual education programs in schools in the area where Mixteco is taught alongside Spanish in the curriculum. The aim of these programs is oftentimes to increase literacy in the language because literacy, reading, and writing is what ends up preserving a culture for the future. And there's lots of community initiatives designed to preserve literature and to convert it into digital sources so that we can continue to take advantage of it. However, the reality is that Spanish continues to dominate the language use in Mexico and abroad, which puts a lot of pressure on these Mixteco speakers. They're forced to learn Spanish to have any kind of upward mobility, right? And the children, a lot of times, even in places where they speak Mixteco, grow up speaking just Spanish or mostly Spanish because that's what they're taught in schools. And it's what's seen as the more important tool for the future than learning Mixteco. And one final challenge facing the idea of preserving Mixteco is that, like I said from the beginning, Mixteco is not one single language, but rather a group of dialects spread out in the different valleys of Mexico, specifically in Oaxaca. And so, since there is not one unified language, it's hard to set a standard and promote literacy in that language, right? So, in fact, maybe before continuing to promote the learning of Mixteco, a good thing to do would be to standardize it, make it easier to teach, and make it easier to learn for future generations. But hey, that's just my thoughts. And so, if you're interested in learning Mixteco, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. If you're in Mexico, specifically if you're in Oaxaca, a lot of local language schools will offer Mixteco immersion programs, language courses, and there's even community centers where you can go and interact with Mixteco-speaking people. As well, many universities have created online courses and have provided other materials to help you learn Mixteco, right? And of course, websites and mobile apps, you could use ChatGPT, that's a fantastic tool, in order to learn this language. And then there's also language learning books, audio resources, and there's even a handful of YouTube channels out there designed to teach and promote the Mixtecan language. And if you really want to get after it, you could jump on down here to Oaxaca and go join some kind of a language immersion program where you're going to be surrounded by the language and get a chance to learn the language. So to wrap things up, what are the current opinions on Mixteco? So for many people, this is a sign of their cultural heritage, and they take a lot of pride in it. Right? They see it as a way to connect with their ancestors by speaking the same language and connect to their cultural heritage. Many in this community believe that language revitalization is a key step in continuing to preserve their culture. However, there are some challenges. One, the stereotype that Mixteco is much more tied to the rural region, which historically it has been, and that Spanish is the more important language for upward mobility in society, specifically in Mexico. And as such, many young Mixtec speakers turn to Spanish. They use Spanish in daily life, and they leave behind their language, similar to how immigrants anywhere will leave behind their language as they travel abroad. Right? Grandparents will come and know the language, know Spanish, learn the basics of English to get by. Then the kids will be bilingual in both, and then the grandkids will be mostly English with a little bit of Spanish or broken Spanish. Usually by that third generation, it's completely gone. Right? However, the good news for Mixteco is there is a growing movement to reclaim the language and to improve it, make it more widespread and more widely used. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video on the Mixtec language and people and culture. If you guys are interested more in this, I suggest you do some research on the web, or feel free to send me a message. I'm happy to discuss these things. This is a huge culture people group where I am living currently in Puerto Escondido, Mexico. So for me, especially having grown up, super fascinated by the idea of indigenous cultures and languages. Living here in Oaxaca is an awesome opportunity for me to see this and interact with it in real life, which is really cool. Be sure to use the link down below, sign up for your verb tense cheat sheet, and get a week's worth of emails to help you supercharge your Spanish learning. Be sure to like, subscribe, all that jazz. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. Muchas gracias.